and welcome to the Hometown Church Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we are back with Pastor Brent Knox.
And we're back with you.
Me,
Yes.
Jesse Roskamp, your host. Thank you for being here. So today we are starting a brand new series, or at least on Sunday, we started a brand new sermon series where we are kind of working our way through an Old Testament book, an Old Testament expository series. We're not going verse by verse through it, but we are taking a look at the book of Joshua from the Old Testament. A very interesting book, kind of a pivotal moment in the story of the Old Testament as we shift out of the Torah and kind of into this new age for the story of Israel as they head into the Promised Land. And so the sermon series that we're going through is called Courageous Faith. And so we're looking at how God makes all these promises to the people of Israel and how he fulfills all those promises, and how we can live according to those promises. And so that's kind of what the focus of this series is, the sermon series. And so here on the podcast, we're going to kind of use this as a companion piece to that sermon series, taking a closer look at the story and maybe addressing some of the harder issues. So yeah, what do you think? Are you ready for it?
Well, I'm ready for it. I think we have some opportunity to fill in some gaps that the weekend service is unable to get to. You know, I mean, when you think about it, Joshua is 20 some chapters, and and Spencer's only got 7 sessions on the weekend services, and 35 minutes per Sunday for a message doesn't give you a lot of time to cover a lot of ground. But look at you and I, we get to fill in the gaps, and we can get to talk as long as we want to here on a particular subject. And so we've got more time, and I think this is going to be great because we're going to parallel here with what's happening in the weekend service. And I just got a special hint to anybody who's a listener here. If you want to get the most out of going through the book of Joshua, then do 3 things. Read Joshua for yourself as we're going through the weekend series, and then follow it up by listening to the podcast and allow us the chance to fill in some gaps. And I have a feeling that by the time you do all that, you really are going to feel like, hey, I know the book of Joshua, and I feel like I'm going to know God better. Because our goal here is to exalt God and show how Joshua actually, in a magnificent way, points to Jesus.
Yeah. I love that point too, that we are trying to know God better through this. And so doing it on your own, but also using us as a resource and using the Sunday sermons as a resource to kind of fill in and get a fuller view of what and who God is. And this book is such a good book for that, because I think a lot of times the places where our faith grows are the places where it gets challenged the most. And Joshua is a very challenging book. It's kind of a stumbling block for a lot of people in their faith, especially people who have not read the Old Testament very much. They kind of get to these parts in the Old Testament that are really difficult and present a lot of really challenging questions. And Joshua is a book that is full of those. And so we're going to be able to address a lot of those questions. And so with that, we want this podcast to be something that is more of a dialogue, not just between us, but between you guys as the viewers. So if you have questions as we're going through this podcast, please reach out to us at podcast@hometownchurch.com. Send in those questions so that we can address those and have a conversation through them and not just leave them lingering, because there's, as much as we can fill in the gaps here from what might get missed in the Sunday sermon, we also aren't going to be able to cover everything.
That's
right?
True. Well, can I tease one hard question in advance?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, the hardest one probably of all, isn't it, is how can a loving and merciful God condone the annihilation of complete civilizations of people?
Yeah.
And that is a huge question that has been a stumbling block for many, many people over the years of placing their faith in God, is seeing God command and advocate for that in the book of Joshua.
Yeah, that's such a hard question.
It is.
And not one that we're going to get to today, but we will get to it on a future episode.
We'll get to it. That means you have to listen to every one of these.
That's right.
Until we get to that big question.
Keep up with us and we'll get there. But let's kind of start off this conversation just by talking about, like, why are we doing this podcast? What is going to be the main focus of our conversations with this?
Well, in some ways, I think we've answered the question, but the main focus of this is going to be for us to give a broad view of the book of Joshua, and show how it points to Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
foreshadows Jesus in some really amazing different kinds of ways, and then we're going to tackle the difficult questions that we've talked about, and I'm really hoping that when we get all said and done with this, that we're going to have a much bigger view of God. We'd be able to admire and worship Him more, especially for His incredible faithfulness, which is the big theme of the book of Joshua.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really good. I think we also want to take a look at this from kind of a historical perspective of what this says, right? Because I think with the Sunday sermon, the focus can kind of be more on application and what are we going
Mm-hmm.
to do with these texts, but it can also be really easy in those situations to forget that these are real historical events that actually really happened, and those are the things that are going to bring up those challenging questions. Because if this isn't just like a morality tale of like how do we decide between good and bad, how do we encourage our faith, it does bring in like, oh, these are real people and these are real things that happened, and that sets the stakes very high for what's happening in these stories. And so I think taking a look at it from that perspective, what does this mean? What does this mean in context of the story, is going to set us up for some really hard conversations to come.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about just the person of Joshua.
Yeah.
He is kind of the center stage, the main focus of this story. Let's kick it off with, who is Joshua? What should we
Well,
know about him?
yeah. Well, what do we know about him? The first time that we meet Joshua is in Exodus chapter 17, and he's a military commander.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first time that we meet him in the Bible, and it's a real interesting story there. He's leading victory of the Israelites over the Amaleks.
Amalekites?
There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Easy for me to say. But this is the interesting story where Moses is sitting on a hill, and Aaron is on one side of him, Hur is on the other side, and they're keeping Moses' hands up in the air. And as long as his hands are up in the air, Joshua down in the valley is winning the battle. But every time Moses lowers his hands, Joshua begins to lose the battle. And I was trying to place myself in Joshua's shoes about that. I don't know for sure if he knew Moses was raising up and lowering his hands, but he probably really learned that day that victory is not so much about military genius, or victory is not about strategizing. That he probably walked away from that battle thinking, I really didn't have anything to do with whether that battle was won or lost. And the real strategy was keeping Moses' hands in the air. And I think this isn't going to be a lesson that's probably kept with Joshua for the rest of his days. And we're going to see this played out on how, even though Joshua is a military commander, victory in God's kingdom does not come by human effort.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see that played out. So that's where we first learn about Joshua, is he's a military commander. Second thing we find out about Joshua is he was one of the 12 spies. So Moses, when they first came to the brink of the promised land, sends out 12 spies to reconnaissance the promised land, and 10 of them come back and they're freaked out because they looked at the inhabitants of the land and said that they were giants and we're only like grasshoppers in their sight. And only 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, had the faith to say, certainly we can conquer this land because God is with us. God has promised us. And so only 2 people entered into the promised land. And it was Joshua and Caleb, and Joshua becomes a example for us of what faith is like over fear. Then the third thing we find out about Joshua is he becomes a personal attendant to Moses. And for a long time, he's assisting Moses, and he was with Moses with some really incredible events. And he got to see Moses interact with God. He was with Moses when Moses was on the mountain and the mountain was covered with the glory of God. He witnessed Moses in the tent of meeting, and Moses allowed Joshua into some of his most personal moments of his life. And you think, how might that have impressed Joshua, seeing Moses interact with God like that, and seeing, in a sense, God being demonstrated right in front of his eyes. And then the last thing we learn about Joshua is he becomes the replacement for Moses. God himself appoints Joshua. He's commissioned in front of all of Israel, and he's the one to receive the charge to lead Israel into the land that Moses himself could not enter. And that's another story, why Moses couldn't enter it. But these are big shoes to fill. How would you like to be the person who replaces Moses? One of the most iconic leaders in the entire Bible. And Moses has been described, he was described as the most humble man on the face of the earth. God does all these things through him. And you're the one to replace Moses? Wow. Big shoes to fill.
Yeah, that's a tall task.
Yes.
But I think it is a really good example of like discipleship that we see in the Old Testament of someone coming along with an older leader and watching how he does it. Right, he's sitting in the tent of meeting with Moses as he's receiving the law from the Lord, and gets to watch how he does that. Then he's delegated authority. Moses sends him out to go do these things, and with under his supervision, and then eventually he takes up the mantle and goes off and does it himself. But yeah, we see Moses commanded to commission Joshua as the next leader by God in Deuteronomy chapter 3, and then we see the fulfillment of that later on in Deuteronomy chapter 31, where first he commissions him in front of the people, and then he commissions him directly before God, and then that is the moment where it's no longer God speaking directly to Moses, but now he's speaking directly to Joshua, and so he's taking up this mantle. He's very much being presented as the new Moses, and we'll see that kind of through the start of the story, is like he is very much being put in this position, very similar, kind of reenacting a lot of the same things that Moses did, as this guy who's going to take up the mantle. And one of the things I think is really interesting is just his name, Joshua.
Sure. Yep.
And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it is interesting to note that he does get a name change. We get a few characters throughout the Bible who receive a new name throughout the story, right? Like Abraham, he was Abram, and then he becomes Abraham. Sarai into Sarah. Just a couple characters like that, and Joshua is one of them. His original name was Hoshua, which just means deliverance or salvation, and Moses gives him a new name after he comes back from scouting out the Promised Land to become Yahoshua. So they add the Yah, which comes from Yahweh, the divine name. So he becomes the first character in the Bible to receive a new name that is directly related to Yahweh, where he puts Yahweh's name in there. So it now becomes Yahweh saves, Yahweh delivers, becomes his new name, which is going to very much be a heavy theme throughout the story, because biblical names carry a lot of significance and a lot of importance. And that's going to get tied in a little bit later when we connect how Joshua is foreshadowing Jesus.
I was going to say, it's a pretty similar name to Jesus.
It is exactly the same name, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it is. Well,
Jesus is the Greek
Yes,
version of Yehoshua, which is the Hebrew version, but both means Yahweh saves.
Yahweh saves.
And so Joshua being presented as the new Moses, this is going to come up a little later. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But then after the death of Moses, we see Joshua being filled with the spirit of wisdom, is what it says. So this is because Moses lays his hands on him, appoints him as the new leader, and now he is the one taking up the mantle going forward. So let's talk a little bit about the story of Joshua. How does this, what is the kind of the grander story of this book? How does it fit in with the greater narrative of the Bible and God's plan of salvation?
Yeah, and I think this is an important question to ask, because I think it's really easy to lose sight of the bigger picture when we read the Bible. We're generally pretty good at having devotional readings. We open up our Bible before we go to work, and we zero in on specific verses, and sometimes I think in our devotional readings, we lose sight of the bigger picture on how verses fit into the bigger picture, or how even entire books like Joshua fit into the bigger picture. I kind of look at it like as a mosaic tile, and we're zeroing in on those beautiful little mosaic tiles, and those tiles are really nice looking, but they have a lot more meaning, a lot more beauty to those tiles when you realize it fits into a bigger picture. And we begin to see how all the pieces fit together. And so there is a bigger picture. And when we can see the bigger picture, it increases our appreciation for God. And I think it expands our hearts, expands our hearts in joy, because we see what God is doing in a mega sense. So what is the bigger picture here with the book of Joshua? Bigger picture is fundamentally it's Jesus. And we'll help put the pieces together here, but it's God's great salvation plan that he started right from the beginning of Genesis, and his story is to restore what was lost, and it will be restored someday, and he's doing it through his son, Jesus Christ. And everything in the Bible is that little mosaic tile that's contributing to that big plan, that big picture. And so Joshua is, a little piece, a little tile is fitting into the bigger picture. And so there's a storyline that Joshua fits into, which we'll get at in a moment. And then there are types or foreshadowings or themes in the book of Joshua that point us and instruct us about the gospel itself. There's gospel themes that kind of come out in the book of Joshua that are kind of gospel-like in nature. And our hope as we go through this podcast is that we'll be able to point those out. I'm really looking forward to the one next week, especially about Rahab and what a gospel theme that is. But there's various nuggets like that are occurring. So what's the big fit? How does Joshua fit into the storyline? We have to start back in Genesis, like I mentioned. Genesis, creation, then there was the fall. Everything gets ruined because of the fall. God promises a savior, and he begins his salvation plan by initiating with Abraham. And there needs to be a coming Messiah that's going to come from a people group. And that people group God chooses to be the Jews. And so God promises Abraham land, descendants. He blesses Abraham. Abraham becomes the father of the Jews. But for the next generation, the number of generations, the Jews, they're just barely hanging on. They're feeble people. They're living on the brink of destruction. And really the big question is when you're going through the end of Genesis, is God going to be faithful to his promise? Are these feeble people that are living on the brink of destruction, are they going to really be God's chosen people and an entire nation coming from? Is that really going to happen? And then we move into the book of Exodus, and they're in slavery now in Egypt. They're multiplying, growing stronger, but they're in slavery in Egypt. And is God going to be faithful to his promises? And then God comes through and redeems Israel from slavery through Moses with these mighty miracles, and the Red Sea parts, and they in a sense they become a nation escaping from Egypt. And that Red Sea moment is one of the great moments that all the Israelites from then on look back on. Say, God, he saved us, and he saved us at the Red Sea. And that's what reminds them that we're his chosen people. He loves us, and he saved us at the Red Sea. Then we come to Leviticus and Numbers, those two books, and God forming a holy nation, following the law that was supernaturally given to him. And then in Deuteronomy, God's preparing them to enter the land. And then comes Joshua, and Joshua becomes the fulfillment of those promises of God giving them a land, and they cross over the Jordan and begin conquering the promised land. And that's how it kind of fits into the big story. And there in that promised land, God establishes a nation that he demonstrates himself through and to the entire world, and eventually brings the Messiah to the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, yeah, I love that picture of a mosaic, that there is something broader going on, but then there's these little pieces. And so we're zooming in on this little piece of the story. And sometimes we can think about these little pieces as like this is the whole story. This is the biggest thing in the world, right? But it is something that is fitting into a grander narrative, and I think that really helps to kind of put into perspective what's happening and why things are happening. Um, but yeah, this is a really key moment in Israel's history because it is the fulfillment of a lot of God's promises. But then also we get to the end of the story, and while some of those promises have been fulfilled, it's not like fully fulfilled. There's still question marks being raised. But I think one of the key verses here, in my mind, when we're talking about like where is this coming in the story? Like what's the purpose of this book? Comes in chapter 1, verse, I just had it here. Verse 13, remember what Moses, the Lord's servant, commanded you when he said, the Lord your God will give you rest and he will give you this land. And so when we're looking at the broader narrative of the story, what God is trying to do is he's trying to bring them into rest. He's trying to bring them into this covenant relationship where they can rest in him. And so that is really the hope and the idea. And a lot of these promises are contingent on their faithfulness to obey and be committed to him fully. We see that God is committed to them fully throughout the story, throughout the entire narrative, all leading up to this. Like he is consistently committed no matter what. They do a lot of things poorly, and he's still fulfilling his promises. And that's going to be a lot of the tension that we see throughout this story heading into the rest of the book of Joshua, is the faithfulness of God versus the faithfulness of his people. And what does he do when his people aren't faithful? Does he still protect them and save them and fulfill his promises, or does he leave them behind and abandon them? Like, what is he going to do here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it'd be helpful too to just kind of look at a broad view at the story and kind of how it's broken down from a macro point of view. We've got 24 chapters in this book, and there's kind of 4 main parts of the story. The first part of the story is Joshua really being presented as the new Moses, him taking up the leadership mantle. He's calling the people to obey. This is chapters 1 through 5. And then he's kind of reenacting a lot of the things that Moses did, right? He's sending spies into the land with the story of Rahab. He's crossing over the Jordan River, like they crossed over the Red Sea. So he's really being presented as this new Moses. And then we get a big chunk from chapters 6 through 12, which is all about the battles, the conquering of the land. There's battles that go well, there's battles that don't go well, and there's this tension that we're going to be exploring. In chapters 13 through 22, we get the division of the land, everyone's favorite part to read, where Joshua is giving out the allotments of land, describing the borders where each of the tribes of Israel is going to inherit. And then we finish up with Joshua's final plea to the people, kind of his Deuteronomy moment where he's talking to his people one last time before he's going to move on and hand off the mantle to somebody else.
Yep, the outlines is pretty good, and then there's some very interesting stories embedded in all.
A lot of really interesting stories along the way. But let's talk a little bit about how Joshua foreshadows Jesus.
Well, let's start with what we already touched on about his name. You mentioned his name change, and his name became to mean Yahweh saves, which Jesus, that is the literal name of Jesus, says that Yahweh saves. How parallel to Jesus can you get? When they're both named Jesus or Yahweh saves, it doesn't mean that Joshua is Jesus, but I think the parallel there is intentional. Both are leading God's people into God's promised rest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it says in Hebrews that Joshua is one unable to give the rest that God was intending. He was only able to give a physical rest, and that physical rest didn't last very long. Jesus' rest is far broader than that, far more important than that, a spiritual rest based on the gospel. But both lead God's people into promise and rest, and Joshua is a great leader that people are to follow, and Jesus is our great leader and conqueror, and has conquered our battles, just like Joshua conquered enemies in the promised land and gave people rest. So Jesus has conquered our greatest enemies, particularly sin and death. And through that conquering has given us an unbelievable spiritual rest. Both of them have defeated the enemies of God's people. But Joshua is a kind of a foreshadowing of something that's greater that's coming.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit more with the name of Joshua, because I thought this was super interesting. But first, right away in Deuteronomy 34, we get the commissioning of Joshua, and he is presented as the new Moses. He's given the spirit of wisdom. And immediately after that, in verse 10, it says that nobody else, like since that day, nobody else like Moses has risen up who could do all these things. So it's like it's almost like, here's the new guy, but he ain't it. like immediately before we even get into his story or get into his own book, like it's like this guy is not going to be the fulfillment of what we're hoping he is, and we're still hoping for that guy to come. So you kind of have that expectation going into it, and Jesus is really like the full fulfillment of what that is. Also, as I was kind of preparing for this and looking at the connections between Joshua and Jesus, what I found really interesting is that there's actually a third Joshua in the Bible, or third Yehoshua, and he comes a little later in the story, and he plays a much smaller role than either of these other two, but it is Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, who was the high priest during the exile. And he gets brought up during kind of these visions that Zechariah has. He's also mentioned in Haggai. But it's during a time when God was going to call his people back into the promised land after they've been sent out into exile. And so I thought it was really interesting that the kind of the connection between all three, right? The first Joshua Son of Nun, is the prophet and the judge, right? The leader of Israel. Kind of more of like a political and militaristic figure who is leading his people into the promised land after they've gone through a period of testing in the wilderness. And he's called to faithfulness, to bring them into their rest. The second Joshua comes as the high priest, a different role, who is in one of the visions, he's presented as kind of like a figure in like dirty rags.
Oh, that's right. That's in Zechariah.
Yeah, and Satan is sitting there accusing him, and God's like, I'm going to actually make his clothes pure, and I'm going to bring you guys back into the promised land. I'm going to fulfill my promises again. So it's a similar thing, just on opposite ends of the spectrum. And then here comes the third Joshua, who is both the judge, the priest, the prophet, the one who is going to actually fully bring them into the rest. Right? They're back in the promised land when he's there, but they're under the oppression of the Roman Empire, and he's going to bring them into a new kingdom, one that is not of this world, that is of something greater. And he is like, not even just his name is God brings salvation, but he is God bringing salvation to his people. So he's the full fulfillment of both ends of the spectrum, and like way above anything that either of them could either be.
Yeah, that's good.
So I thought that was really interesting as I was reading through that. But yeah. And then actually all kind of those ties get brought back together in that Hebrews passage that you talk about as you kind of go through the rest of it. So it says, just kind of through the end of chapter 4, I'll kind of read the whole thing because I think it ties all three of them together really cool. So it says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. For the person who has entered his rest has rested from his own works, just as God did from his. Let us then make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience. For the word of God is living and effective, and sharper than any double-edged sword, penetrating as far as the separation of soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. No creature is hidden from him, but all things are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. Therefore, since we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in the time of need. So I thought it was just so cool how all three of those themes and kind of the we get that little passage about the sword, the word of God being this sword, coming in there, which ties right back into this commissioning of Joshua in Joshua 1 of be strong and courageous, right? Meditate on the law day and night. Like, let that not be something that leaves your heart. Like all of those themes getting tied up into this one idea that Jesus is the true fulfillment of all of that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Do you have anything else there on Joshua foreshadowing Jesus before we keep going?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, let's talk about how Joshua demonstrates the faithfulness of God. This is kind of like the big idea that we're holding on to as we're going through this sermon series. So let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, we've touched on it a little bit, but way back, the foundational promises given to Abraham that guide the whole nation of Israel and his intent on bringing a Messiah that will bless all the families and the ends of the earth into the world. Back in Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 13, Genesis chapter 15, Genesis 17, basically God says, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan. Mm-hmm. That is the land that I'm going to give you to expand into, to become the nation that I'm choosing you to believe, choosing and you to be in. And so the big question is God going to be faithful to his promises? And I think what we lose sight of is 600 years have passed between God's promise to Abraham and Israel crossing the Jordan into the land. 600 years. That's a long time to be waiting for God's promises to come about. And in that story, there were a lot of ups and downs, and there were a lot of crisis, and there was a lot of disobedience by the people. There was a lot of human weakness. There was a lot of time that went by. And I think I want to get to it. Let's see here, Joshua chapter 21. That brings us to Joshua chapter 21, verse 43. I'm going to read these verses because after 600 years, and with God working through Joshua and leading the Israelites, it says this: So the Lord gave to Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he solemnly promised their ancestors. None of their enemies could stand against them, for the Lord helped them conquer all their enemies. And here's the big verse: not a single one of all the good promises of the Lord that the Lord had given to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Everything he had spoken came true. Our God is a promise-making, promise-keeping God, and he's faithful, even if it takes 600 years, even if it's scattered with a bunch of human weakness and a human failure. God has promises. He, in his mercy, he's given promises. We can now look back as believers and look at how faithful God is, demonstrated now through the book of Joshua. And we ourselves may be weak. We ourselves might have some ups and downs. It may take a long time, but God will be faithful.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think one of the things that always sticks out to me from this is one, that whole section of chapters 13 through 22 is the allotment of land. I think it was from the Bible Project kind of summary video of Joshua. They talk about, a lot of people skip over this passage, these chapters, because it's really boring.
It's a little boring.
It feels like you're just reading a map with no pictures. And it's like, man, why am I reading this? but it's also so significant because of what it represents, right? Like the detail, the this is the fulfillment of his promises, like and so for the Israelites, for the Jews, like this was everything. This was God
It's a big
being
deal.
God,
Yeah.
right? Like actually fulfilling all these things that they went through the 40 years in the wilderness. They went through, hundreds of years of slavery, and God finally brought them into this place and gave them the rest that they wanted, that He promised them in the first place, right? That they were hoping for and continuing on and struggling for. The second thing I think that really stands out is this is also said before they actually take all of the land. So God gives them the land, and He's like, "Hey, all of my promises have been fulfilled." And this is leading up to this point. We get a ton of stories of them going into battles. Some go well, some don't go well, and always the key factor in these is how Israel is responding to God. Right? God gives them a command: go do this thing. If they do it and they follow it to the letter, things go really well. If they don't do it, things go very poorly. And so God has fulfilled His promises by bringing them into the land. He's shown them, hey, things are going to kind of depend on how you respond to my promises. And He's saying, I have fulfilled my promises. The land is yours, but they still need to go and take it. And what we see is that they fail to fully do that, right? It gets stated later. We get like a time jump in Joshua 23, where it's many years later, and they've failed to drive out all the inhabitants of the land. Like they haven't fully conquered it. There's some tribes that haven't taken their allotment of land because they just didn't go do it. They were scared. They acted like the spies back when Joshua was young, right? And they saw these people and they're like, we can't do this. Like God said He fulfilled this thing. And so I think it's really interesting that we get that tension of God has fulfilled His promises. He's given them victory, but they also have to claim that victory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this was actually my promise verse the first time I went to Italy last year. And it was because of that reason. God has given us victory in these things that we've done. But there's also a response that's needed in order to claim that victory. Like it's not just going to be handed to us.
Right.
We have to respond to these
Right.
things.
Right. That's good. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah. Yeah. And just to back up a little bit more about how pivotal this moment is in the history of Israel on demonstrating God's faithfulness, it is expounded on more in the Psalms. A number of Psalms that are celebrating God's faithfulness look back on this very moment of going into the promised land and getting and conquering the land of Canaan, and Israel recognized that this was a really, really, really big deal in their history, and a big deal about counting on God when times are tough. Like Psalm 44 celebrates this moment and recognizes that Israel didn't take the land by their own strength.
Mm-hmm.
It was not, it says there, it was not by their sword that they won the land. It was by, Lord, your right hand, your arm, and the light of your face. And so the psalm is kind of teaching dependence and reliance and counting on God's faithfulness. And that psalm was written when a time when everything seemed like it was falling apart. And the logic is God, you were faithful back then. Can I count on your faithfulness now, even though it seems like everything is falling apart? So that's Psalm 44. Psalm 78, the whole psalm practically is a poetic retelling of the first 21 chapters of Joshua. And again, the theme is God's just faithful across the generations. And then one of my favorite parts is Psalm 105. And this is one of the really clear psalms that connects Abraham, the promises to Abraham, to Joshua's fulfillment. And let me just read it. It says, He is the Lord our God. His justice is seen throughout the land. This is verse 8. He always, always stands by His covenant or His promise. The commitment He's made to 1,000 generations. This is the covenant He made with Abraham and the oath He swore to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree and to the people of Israel as a never-ending covenant. And this is it. I will give you the land of Canaan as your special possession. And He said this when they were few in number, a tiny group of strangers in Canaan. And then the psalm just celebrates the faithfulness of God. It's just wonderful. And that we've got the same God that is God today as he was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Just as God was amazingly faithful to his promises to Israel, God will be faithful to his promises to us. And so he's so gracious that he even made promises in the first place. Will we be the people who takes those promises to the bank and really count on them and let them direct our lives?
Yeah. Amen. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I'm really excited about this series and kind of where we're going forward. Before we take a look at kind of the highlights of what we're going to be talking about through the rest of the series and kind of the themes of Joshua, was there anything from this last Sunday's message that was really like standing out that we really want to touch base on before we go forward?
Yeah, I was reflecting on that a little bit here this morning. I was just impressed again how a crucial moment this is for Joshua. It says in verse 1 and 2 of Joshua 1. Maybe we could read it. What if we read that part, Joshua 1? If I can get to Joshua. Here we go, Joshua 1. He says, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun. So the joke is, of course, Joshua, son of Nun. This is one of the rare guys that didn't have a father in the... Never mind.
I heard it was the second miraculous birth.
Yeah, there you go. Son of Nun, Moses' assistant. He said, Moses, my servant is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I'm giving you. Well, I think what struck me is when he says, the time for you has come. There is a time, I believe, in many of our lives that God wants us to take a step. The time has come to take a step of faith. There's a time that's going to come for some of us to replace those who came before us. There's going to be a time for us to step up. There's going to be a time for us to get outside of our comfort zone. And I'm asking myself, and I'm even asking the listeners here, has that time come for you to take a new responsibility, to take initiative, to get outside your comfort zone? God has given you gifts. Is it time for you to step into it? The time came for Joshua, and I think there's going to be a time that comes for us. That's one thing that struck me. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I'm giving them. I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you'll be on the land I have given you, from the Negev wilderness into the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north, from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous, for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors that I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you'll be successful in everything you do. So study this book of instruction continually. Meditate on it day and night so that you'll be sure to obey everything written in it. Only then you'll be prosper and succeed in all that you do. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. What an incredible promise. And I think another thing that struck me is success here is being defined by obedience, not by military strategy. And we're going to find out some crazy plans that God gave Joshua to conquer the land. And it wasn't because of his military strategy. Meditating on the word and doing what he says is what God asks us to do.
Yeah.
And he will end up opening the doors. He will be the one who will direct us in his victory. Only trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
but to trust and obey is what the old hymn says.
Yeah. I love that. And I think kind of coming back from that message that Spencer gave, that idea that it is the presence of the Lord that is going to carry us through,
Yeah.
right? Like his promise there, and I will be with
I'll
you.
be with you. What a big promise.
Yeah, and that was the same thing he said to Moses, right? When Moses was scared on Mount Sinai, not wanting to go face Pharaoh, that was God's promise to him. I will be with you. It's his promise to Joshua. I will be with you, and then to his disciples in the Great Commission, I will be with you.
Yeah, let's pause on that. The Great Commission. That's the same commission given to us.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like in an incredibly difficult, challenging commission, we're to, in a sense, spiritually go out there and conquer land
Mm-hmm.
by sharing the gospel, making disciples of all nations. That is the commission to direct our lives. We can get intimidated by it and by the depth, the scope, the challenge of it, but the promise still is the same. I am with you.
Yeah.
Do we really believe that God's presence is with us?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Moses complained one time, Lord, if you're not going to go with me, I'm not going to go do this. But God has promised, I'm going to be with you wherever you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And where we're going next is through the end of Joshua.
There we go.
Let's take a look at just kind of what's to come. What are some of the highlights of Joshua that we're going to be looking forward to? Maybe some of the key themes that we're going to look at.
Well, I think we're going to, we've already mentioned, we're going to be seeing real clearly that God wants us to cherish his word and obey, because if there isn't obedience, then things just don't go well.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be seeing that. We're going to be seeing how to be strong and very courageous. We're going to see some really striking stories about that. And we're going to see some really striking gospel themes. We're going to see how power comes through weakness. We're going to see that bleed out in this whole story. Israel was not a mighty nation with powerful soldiers. They were unlikely victors. And the story really is about God's faithfulness and his grace, not about our abilities or our strength. And that he uses very unlikely people like Rahab. We'll talk about that next week.
Mm-hmm.
There's some interesting stories that are going to bleed through here, like the Gibeonite deception. There's another interesting story later on about how the Israelites almost messed everything up by an incredible presumption. And what an interesting story. And then we're going to talk about one of the most difficult questions in the entire Bible. Why does God advocate for the annihilation of nations? And this is one of the great criticisms of the Bible. So we'll get into all that.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. Well, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of really good stories, a lot of really challenging stories, a lot of really tough questions to face, but we're going to do it all together.
Yes.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you guys for joining in on this episode of the Hometown Church podcast. We are going to continue through the rest of this sermon series, following along, kind of tracking along with each of the stories, each of the sermons, and continuing on with this format. So if you have any questions or thoughts that you want to send in that we can talk about while we're on this podcast and discussing these stories, please do that. Send those into Hometown Church, podcast at hometownchurch.com. And we'll see you on the next one.
Great.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Wow.